Today we're going to be talking about a number of things. So first we're going to start about talking about kind of the distinction between what is an invasive plant versus a weed, because a lot of times those terms get used interchangeably. Why are they a problem? And then we're going to go through and actually look at some of those plants to help you make sure that you can identify some of them. And we're both things that are weedy plants that come into your garden, or weedy plants that maybe if you have some land, maybe you have a 40-acre parcel, you have a woodlot, you have a prairie, maybe you have a wetland, some of those species, and then garden plants that become invasive. So a lot of our plants that are invasive in our natural areas come from our gardens, and so we're going to let you know about those so that if you have those in your property, maybe you might want to start thinking about getting rid of some of them. Then we're going to be talking about control methods, what you can use to control some of these. And then we're going to finish up with some information about earthworms. You may have heard some things about earthworms lately, and we'll talk to you about why they're not always so great. So starting off with weeds. Most people think about plants that aren't wanted as being weeds. And so weeds, from an ecologist perspective, they tend to be the species that are undesirable and tend to grow in disturbed areas. Crops, your yard, kind of green spaces that are unmanaged, and they can cause a lot of impacts. But ecologists tend to think of invasive plants as the ones that actually invade into natural areas. So into our forests, our woodlots, into our wetlands, into lakes and grasslands. And so these are the ones that cause, and they may cause economic harm, but they also cause ecological harm in those areas. And we'll go through some of those ecological harms that they cause. So some of you are familiar with garlic mustard, and that's the plant on the left here. And garlic mustard is a really common invasive plant. And so it's one that many of us have had to deal with in our own yards. If you do any volunteer work in any kind of a local park or local natural area, you've probably been managing garlic mustard. Very easy to identify. The first year it just has small basal rosettes. The second year it sends up these flowering stalks that then can actually will send very quickly will produce these four-petaled white flowers. And if you crush the leaves or any part of it, it smells like garlic. And so it's really easy to identify. And garlic mustard, if you let it go to seed, those seeds will be in the ground and will be germinating over the next 10 to 15 years. Most of them will germinate in the first couple of years, but you'll still have a few that are germinating for a while. So it's really important with a species like this, when it first comes into your property, to get it out. Don't let it go to seed. If you've already been having it going to seed for a number of years, then you need to really think about if you're going to be able to willing to take on the control that it takes to get rid of it, because that means you're going to be having to go back and monitor and control every single year for the next 10 to 15 years. And so you really want to think about it if you have the capacity to do that, and if it's really something that's as important to you. So what happens with species like this is they go from just one plant gets in, one seed gets established somehow, a squirrel or raccoon or your shoes bring a seed in, gets established in the middle of this patch of wildflowers. Like here, you can see that one little garlic mustard plant. And then very quickly it goes, in just a few years, it can go to a complete understory of garlic mustard and completely outcompeting all those native wildflowers. And so this is something that's really important, that if you don't want to have a sea of an invasive plant like garlic mustard, then you really want to be able to get it under control pretty quickly. While we're on garlic mustard, I'll just mention that this plant actually is allelopathic, so it actually produces a chemical in its roots that can kill not only other herbaceous plants that are smaller than it, but it also can kill the mycorrhizal fungi that tree roots need in order to absorb nutrients. And so mature trees that have garlic mustard growing around them are being compromised by the garlic mustard itself, even though it's only this tiny little plant compared to a big mature tree. And so there's a lot of things that these plants cause that aren't necessarily really obvious. So how do I know if I've got an invasive plant or not? So there's a number of things you can do to try to figure out if something is invasive. Of course, identification is an important part of that. But first, does it look like it's really spreading quickly in your property? Is it kind of eliminating the other species? And is it dominating the site? If that last photo looked like it was clearly dominating the site. You got a plant like that, you've got something that is invasive. And then finding out what it is, and then find out, is it known to be invasive somewhere else? And there's lots and lots of websites, and I'll show you some later, later that can tell you if something's going to be known to be invasive. And you may have something that hasn't been really reported to be invasive elsewhere, but maybe is for you. And that's important to let us know if you run across things like that. So there's a number of characteristics in a plant that make something invasive, and we have thousands and thousands of plants that have been introduced to North America from Europe and from Asia, other parts of the world, and however, only a small percentage of those actually have become invasive. And it's those particular plants that have the ability to do these kind of things where they grow and reproduce very rapidly, both by seed and oftentimes vegetatively. They may have rhizomes or runners or some other form of reproductive form that allows them to reproduce very quickly. It allows them, they can outcompete other species by doing things like secreting those toxins in the soil like garlic mustard does, or things like buckthorn and honeysuckle are two really common invasive shrubs around here. They both leaf out really early and hold their leaves on really late. And so when they're leafed out early in the spring, that's normally the time for woodland wildflowers to be able to bloom and to grow before the trees put on their leaves. Well, then all of a sudden you've got honeysuckle and buckthorn in there, and they are now all leafed out, and the wildflowers below them no longer can get that sun, that little window of sun that they get in the spring. They also can have ability to use excess nutrients. So invasive plants tend to like a lot of high nutrients, things like sediments and high nitrogen. And so when we have a lot of runoff from an urban area or from farm fields or something like that, we tend to get a lot more of these invasive plants. Or if you've ever put in a prairie, then you've been told do not fertilize. Prairie plants don't need additional fertilizer. They actually do better if it's a little lower fertility, because the weeds do better with the higher fertility. And so, so these plants have that ability to take up those excess nutrients. And one of the big ones is that when these plants were introduced here, so when people came over in the, from the 1600s through now, and they brought plants with them, generally they didn't bring the soil, and they generally didn't bring the insects that came along with them. You're not allowed to bring insects into this country, but plants are introduced all the time. And so the insects that kept these things in check back in Europe or back in Asia are not here. And so most of these plants, middle of the summer, you can go out and look at a Norway maple leaf or a garlic mustard leaf or a honeysuckle leaf, and there's almost nothing that's eaten it. Whereas if you look at the leaves of some of our native plants, they're all chewed up. There's lots of things that have been eating them because that's what they've evolved with these critters that have fed on them. And so there's some big differences between our natives and our non-natives. And so there's a lot of impacts that are happening by those invasive plants. The most obvious is that they displace our native vegetation. They also will limit tree regeneration. So when you have a dense shade being produced by honeysuckle or some other shrub, the seedlings of the native trees have a really hard time growing. It alters the soil nutrients. It actually, with something like buckthorn, it's very high in nitrogen, and the nitrogen breaks down very quickly, as opposed to like oak trees where they're very high carbon. And oak leaves will lay on your ground for several years before they're completely broken down. But with buckthorn, in a few months, those leaves are completely gone. Either the worms have eaten them up or they've just decomposed, and so they cycle that nitrogen very quickly. It also degrades a lot of wildlife habitat. And a lot of, especially our invertebrates, are very specific about the native species that they actually live on. Most of our invertebrates only have a few host plants that they actually survive on. And so when we lose those host plants, we also lose that wildlife. And for the most part, a lot of our native ecosystems, we have very few remnant native ecosystems left in North America. We used to be mostly forest, or prairie and oak savanna in this part of southern Wisconsin, and we now have like less than 1/8 of 1% of each prairies and oak savannas. And those tiny little remnants that are left, we're having to constantly battle against the invasive species that are trying to get in there and are impacting those. So just going to show you a couple of these species as we go through. Here's a great example of buckthorn leafing out early and shading out everything below it. And there's several species of European buckthorn, and most of them look very much alike. We have a relatively new one that's come in from Asia that has a little bit shinier, longer leaves and looks a little bit different, but they all act about the same. And they basically get in that 5 to 15-foot range of height. They cause really dense stands underneath the forest. And they have that very fragrant flowers in the spring, and then these fruits that are eaten by the birds. And so the birds spread these fruits around. So and one of the things that these things do is that because they leaf out early, then birds that want to nest will come and nest in the honeysuckle because they realize that there's good cover there. But that because the formation of the honeysuckle, they're fairly short, and so the actual crotches where they can build their nests are very low, and so they have very high predation rates there. So they have very high predation rates, and so they end up losing most of their eggs and most of their nestlings because of that. Common buckthorn, another one that's super common around here. A lot of you may have buckthorn that you're having to deal with. Very shiny, kind of oval leaves with very small serrations on it. It's dioecious, meaning that there's male plants and female plants. So the female plants produce these black berries, and these berries actually have a chemical in them that's used as a laxative. That's why it was introduced to this country as a medicinal plant. Its scientific name is Rhamnus cathartica, and cathartic means a laxative. And so the birds eat this, and then they have diarrhea. And so that's if you have ever had your car covered with bird poop, you probably have a buckthorn nearby. And then they also, I mentioned that leaving in that nitrogen, and they can grow up very quickly. This is a forested area where they did a timber cut, and they took out the larger trees, and there was glossy buckthorn in the understory, and it just exploded. And so none of the trees can get established now. So one of the other things about native versus non-native trees and shrubs is that, remember we talked about invertebrates and other arthropods, meaning spiders and other things like that, that feed on those native species. So when you have a diversity, an abundance of species in the understory of a forest, then you're going to have a lot more birds than can be supported by that. As opposed, and like an oak tree supports many more types of species than a Norway maple, for example. Whereas if you have a big stand of buckthorn, there's very little that lives in there. And if you look at butterfly use of some of these plants, in general, they've done some studies and they've looked at what butterflies use of native plants versus non-native plants. And then you can see that the caterpillars much prefer native plants to feed on instead of the non-natives. Economic impacts of some of these species can be really important. Forest production has been a big problem in this state. When you have situations like that buckthorn taking over when you do a timber sale, and all of a sudden you don't have any trees coming up, you just have these invasives coming up. Big problem. A lot of these species are also a problem in agriculture. Canada thistle, for example, big problem both in agriculture and in natural areas. Some of them cause a lot of shoreline damage, and I'll show you Japanese knotweed in a few slides here and what it can do to shorelines. They can reduce your property values, and it's just really hard to hike through these areas when you've got these dense stands and you can't even get through them. And some of these plants are actually toxic as well. So we'll talk about a few of those. Japanese knotweed, some of you may have had Japanese knotweed, and you may be battling with it right now. It's a plant that has very heart-shaped leaves. It's pretty distinctive. It can get about 15 feet high, and it grows from that height every year. It dies back every winter and then comes back up from shoots. And this plant evolved in Japan on volcanoes. So its niche is to come back in after there's been a volcano. And so it has this great root system underground, and it can poke through things like lava and concrete. And so you have situations like this where it just pops right in through. And so it actually goes into the foundations of building really easily, especially if people have planted this as a landscape foundation planting. And so it's a problem, with in buildings, but it's also a big problem ecologically ecologically, especially when it gets into shores. And so this is really typical of a lot of the rivers in the New England area, where it gets established just by a root fragment will float downstream, get established, and within a few years you have this huge colony. This is actually clonal, so this is actually one plant that spreads vegetatively and just completely dominates the shoreline. And then in the winter, it dies back because it's a perennial, but it only stays alive underneath the ground, and so then you get a lot of erosion. So big problem species, really difficult one for people to control. Parsnip is very different. It grows in our grasslands, and this is one that's will burn you. Anybody in here ever gotten burned by parsnip? Yeah, if you've been burned by parsnip, then you know it. And a lot of people think they got poison ivy, but the doctor says, this doesn't really look like poison ivy, because it's actually a physical burn. So when the sap of the poison ivy gets on your skin, like in this case, it probably just like it's scraped across the guy's leg, and then it's exposed to sunlight, then you get this intense burn. And it's not an allergy like poison ivy is, so everybody's vulnerable to this. And so this plant is really common in a lot of our grasslands, and it's fairly easy to control by mowing or by hand pulling, but you have to know what its is, and you have to get it before it goes to seed. And if you mow it when it's in this stage here, that's great. If you wait till it's got brown seeds on it, you're just spreading those seeds around. Okay, another real problem that we found about recently is that some of these invasive plants actually increase the abundance of some tick-borne diseases. So we know Lyme's disease is a huge problem here in Wisconsin, probably one of the worst places for Lyme disease, and it's moved by ticks. And we also have several other tick-borne diseases like ehrlichiosis and several others now. And the tick and the disease is actually hosted by rodents, which really like these very dense shrubby places. And so when you have a dense stand of barberry or of honeysuckle, then it increases the number of those reservoirs, and then it increases the abundance of ticks with Lyme disease. So getting rid of those will help reduce your chance of getting Lyme disease. I do want to cover very quickly the regulations related to invasive species. And for a number of years when I've gone and give talks like this, and people have said, well, why do we still allow these things to be sold? And so we finally got legislative authority to actually develop a law about this. And so we developed a rule, and in 2009, we actually got it in place. And then a few years ago, we started working on revising that rule, because in the first round, we very purposefully didn't put all the species in it that we knew we eventually would want to regulate. We wanted to give people a chance to get used to the new law. And so now we have the second group of species are in there. So there's two regulated categories, the prohibited category and the restricted category. So the prohibited category are those that either are not here yet as far as we know, or they're only in a few locations. And we think that there's a potential that we can actually eradicate them. So ones that we really want, wherever they're found, we want people to help us, let us know so we can get rid of them so they don't spread into everybody else's property. The restricted species are the ones we've already been talking about, the ones that are already widespread and that really, realistically, we cannot eradicate them statewide. You may be able to eradicate them on your own property, or you may be able to get rid of them on your property, but statewide, they're just too abundant. And then we have a couple other categories as well. There's a caution category of ones that we think these are going to be a big problem in the future, or they could be a big problem, but we don't know enough yet. And so something that we're letting people know, probably better off not to be using these. And then we also have a non-restricted category. These are things that they're already so widespread, things like Creeping Charlie, that there's not much we could do to minimize the spread of it. So we're just not going to restrict it. So prohibited species, real important that if you find prohibited species, or you think you might have found a prohibited species, let us know. And ideally, you should either take a photo of it, that you can send us a photo, or get a voucher specimen and send us a voucher specimen. Put it in the mail, send it to me, and we'll figure out what it is. And give us, of course, the location information as well. And so provide us the information that we need so that we can then figure out if that's what it is, and then we can work with whoever the landowner is to actually work on getting it removed. So the best way to send that in by email would be through this email address, and that's for any kind of invasive species that you might find. And then we'll follow up and work with people to try to get controlled. So the actual regulations on these categories are fairly similar for both the prohibited and the restricted species. There's one big difference on the two of them that I'll cover. So for both species, you can't transport them, which means moving them around. You can't transfer them, meaning buy them, sell them, give them away. And you can't introduce them with plants that would be planting them out on the landscape. The big difference between these two species is the word possession. If you happen to possess a buckthorn on your property, then we're not going to tell you that you have to get rid of it. It'd be great if you did get rid of it, but we're not going to require it. But if you possess a kudzu, you're the first person in the state that we find kudzu on, it just happens to be on your property, we're going to work with you to try to get rid of that. We don't want you to keep that kudzu because it will then spread from your property to your neighbor's property, and the birds are going to move it around, and pretty soon we're going to have a big problem. So these regulations are in place for all of the species. We do have a few exemptions that are in place to help make it more feasible for people. So if you're a volunteer working on a local park and you're doing a garlic mustard pull, you can transfer these things around, you can transport them for the purpose of disposing them or identifying them or controlling them. You also might be able to get a permit for educational purposes or for research purposes. And for some of these species, especially the ones that we just listed, a lot of them are the ornamental species, and some we have cultivar exemptions, and I'll talk about some of those as we go through them. And then there's also, we developed these best management practices for organizations like highway departments, that they're going down the highway and they're mowing these things, and they can't avoid all the time moving these things around. And so the best management practices tell them you should be mowing at this particular time in order to minimize the spread of these things. And so if they follow those best management practices, then they're complying with the law. We also have a nursery stock phase out, and this is just for the species that have just been listed in the last year, and they're only for the restricted species, those ones that are already fairly widespread. And so for these, for nurseries that already have them in their ground, like if you're a Bruce Company and you lined out a bunch of these cultivars of Japanese barberry and you've still got them in stock, we don't want Bruce Company to have to rip up all their stock and destroy thousands of dollars worth of stock. Instead, we're going to allow them to go ahead and sell those for the next 4 years from now for woody species and 2 years for herbaceous species. This started a year ago, but only for what's already in their stock. You can't bring it in. If you're a garden center and you're bringing in your plants, you can't bring them in. You can't propagate anymore. We just want to get rid of what's actually out there already. And so if that applies to you, if you own a nursery, then, and you have any questions, let me know. So we're going to talk about now some landscape plants that become invasive. And I'm going to run through these fairly quickly because some of you may have these and some of you may not. This is a tree that most of us aren't real familiar with, Amur cork tree, and we found that we have several large populations in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, up in Chippewa County, they now have found that they have many large populations of like 5 to 10 acres that we're going to have to deal with. And it probably came from a couple of plantings, and the birds took these berries from the female plants and planted them around inadvertently. So this one actually, again, it has a male plant and a female plant, and the male plants are allowed because they're not spreading the berries. It's only the females that are not going to be allowed. Real easy to identify by this bright yellow inner bark. Princess tree. This is one that looks very much like catalpa, if you're familiar with the catalpa tree at all. But catalpa has those long, skinny pods that look like cigars. The princess tree has fuzzier leaves, and the pods, the fruit pods, are smaller and more rounded. But they produce lots and lots of seeds. And the flowers also look like catalpa, but the leaves are heart-shaped, and they range from being 6 inches across to being 2.5 feet across. Very fast-growing tree, and one that is prohibited, so we really want to get rid of all of these that are out there as far as, and we're working on it with the ones that we've found so far. Callery pear is an interesting one. Super common landscape tree, being used all the time, especially as a street tree. And when they initially released these, there were many different cultivars, and they were all sterile. So we didn't have to worry about these things spreading, because most people don't want fruits like this falling on their sidewalk or falling in their lawn. So they're sterile, supposedly. Well, what's happened is we're now seeing that they're all producing these fruits, and in the states just to our south, calorie repair is showing up everywhere. Really common in woods, in open areas, on roadsides, really common. And what they found is that they're actually crossing between, if you plant one cultivar on this block and another cultivar on this block, and they're within bird pollinate or bee pollinating distance, they're crossing. And so now we found that my very rough observations this fall, about half of the trees I saw had fruits in the Madison area this fall, which means we're going to start having them naturalizing. We're going to start having problems with them soon too. We haven't seen that when we first, when we did this rule a couple of years ago, we didn't have any evidence of any wild calorie pears in Wisconsin, and now we've been finding them in a few places. Amur maple is another one that's spreading just in certain areas, and we think that it's the actual straight species that's the problem, and so all the cultivars are exempt. Burning bush, one that a lot of people have burning bush, but we also are finding that in some areas it gets really invasive. So a lot of forests that look like this, where just the whole understory is burning bush. And it's pretty distinctive because it has those very pink leaves in the fall. And so we don't know exactly which species are problematic. We know that, again, the straight species, and there's one cultivar called Nordine that one of our nursery people we're working with has seen it in his nursery just explode and spread all over the place. And so those are the ones that are restricted for now. It might be later that we find other cultivars that are a problem, and they may have to get restricted as well. Japanese barberry, we're basing what we've done on some research that was done out in Connecticut, where they grew out about 70 different cultivars of Japanese barberry and found which ones had the most fruits and which ones were most viable. And so of those, we have the 25 most weedy that we've restricted. Oriental bittersweet is one that we're finding is very widespread in a number of areas, and where it's spread, it causes huge problems. If you've ever taken a walk in the UW Arboretum here in Madison in the Grady Tract, which is south of the Beltline, up until a few years ago, it looked like this. This huge, it's just this vine growing all over everything. And it will climb up into the tops of trees. It will actually girdle the trees by wrapping around it and basically choking off the trees. Very problematic. It's fairly easy to tell from the native bittersweet by the fruits. So this is the native bittersweet here. It has large clusters of deeper, redder fruits at the ends of the stems, whereas the non-native has smaller clusters at each of the leaf nodes. The non-native also has much more rounded leaves, whereas the native is narrower leaves that are more tapered. Porcelain berry, related to grapes, it's grown as an ornamental. This one is prohibited now, so all populations need to be controlled. Again, it spreads just like grapes by birds, and it can grow just like grapes, which can get into the trees and really kind of wreak some havoc. The difference is that grapes have a lot of native predators that feed on them and keep them in check. Wisteria is an interesting one because it's not supposed to be hardy here. The Japanese and Chinese wisterias both are only supposed to be, like a zone south of us. And yet we have a population up in central Wisconsin that was several acres of this stuff that had gotten planted, just one plant, and it spread in that area. And so these now are prohibited as well. However, there's a very nice Kentucky wisteria that's native to North America, and that one has lots of cultivars, and so you still have a wisteria that's available to you. Okay, who can name this plant on the left? Dame's rocket is what I heard. Correct. And what's the plant on the right? Phlox, yes, garden phlox. So the difference here is that Dame's rocket has 4 petals. Phlox has 5 petals. Dame's rocket is in the mustard family. All the mustards have 4 petals. So Dame's rocket is the troublesome one here, and it's invasive, and the phlox is not. And so here's a situation where you could have, an invasive plant that you might be growing. You could easily replace it with one that's non-invasive. Moneywort's another one that we've just added on this year. It's a very small vine that grows very prostrate on the ground, but it gets into floodplain forests and can completely carpet the ground underneath the floodplain forest. So this is one that we've only regulated the green leaf varieties. We haven't regulated the yellow leaf varieties. Goutweed, a lot of you probably groan when you see this plant because it's really a pain to get rid of if you happen to move into a house that has this. And then it moves into forests as well. And so this is one that there's no reason why anybody should be planting goutweed. This is just a problem plant. And it really can be very difficult to get rid of. Garden heliotrope, this is one that we're just seeing in a few areas, especially in northern Wisconsin, where it gets into wetlands and really takes off quickly. Just one to watch out for. This is a Balfour's Touch Me Not is a jewel weed. We actually have 2 jewel weeds that we added to the list this time around. There's another one that's much taller and has very deep crimson kind of flowers on it that we've only found a couple populations in Wisconsin. This one I started seeing in landscapes around Madison, and it spreads very quickly. It's a jewel weed. It's an annual, so it spreads really quickly, but it's also really easy to control by just hand pulling because it's just an annual. So as long as you pull it before the seeds develop, then you can keep it under control very easily. Yellow iris, this one is not native. A lot of people think it is. Can get into shorelines and really kind of wreak havoc on shorelines especially and in some wetlands. Then we have a couple of aquatic plants that we didn't think were going to be able to survive this far north. Both water hyacinth and water lettuce. Both are really beautiful floating water plants that people put into their water gardens, and most people deal with them appropriately. At the end of the season, they let them freeze out, or they dispose of them in their compost pile or something. But then there are a few people that think, oh, I can't let this go, so I'm going to dump it into the river. And so we've now had multiple occurrences of both water lettuce and water hyacinth that have overwintered in the Mississippi River and a number of other water bodies as well for several years. And if you've ever grown this in your water garden, you know it reproduces very, very quickly. And we had acres and acres of these that we had to pull out this year. And so we now have evidence that it is overwintering. And as much as we don't like having to regulate something that is a really nice ornamental that most people use responsibly, we can't make sure everybody uses it responsibly. So there's some things we can do to prevent some of the spread. First step is prevention. Don't let these things get in. Next is early detection. Find them early and then control them. And then restoring the native community. I'm not going to get into restoring today. But prevention, the first thing is don't use species that are known to be invasive. If somebody tells you that something you have is invasive, then look it up. Find out if it really is. Stop the site disturbances, or maybe you're allowing some of these things coming in, and minimize the spread of the seed. Oftentimes people bring these things in unknowingly by moving in plants from someplace else, by moving in soil or compost, or even just off their boots. And if your neighbors happen to have some of these things, then share some information with them about it. We have lots of these little wild cards that are at the booth that the IPAW, Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin, has here, and you can share those with your neighbors. And don't let things go to seed. If you can avoid it, really minimize allowing things to go to seed and then cleaning off your own gear from one place to another. So early detection requires that you actually learn how to identify these things, of course, and really get to know the ones that are possibilities for moving into your area, and then monitor the site on a regular basis. If you happen to have a forested area and you don't have garlic mustard in it yet, you are really lucky, and you will eventually get garlic mustard. So you should be monitoring that site on a regular basis, and as soon as that garlic mustard starts showing up, you start pulling it, and you pull it every year. And you may want to mark the area, may want to map it, but you want to go back every single year and remove it, because one time alone is not going to control something. I'm going to try to explain this graph a little bit. Basically, this shows how it's important to catch things early. So this is when you can detect something in here. Acres infested over time, and control costs. So if you catch something when it just first comes in, first plant, you don't allow it to go to seed, super easy. You just pulled it up, get rid of it, and no problem. If you wait just a little bit longer and it's now gone to seed, you can still get it controlled if it hasn't really taken off, and still without a lot of effort. If you wait until it's really a big population, you go, oh, this is a problem, something I probably should have noticed earlier, then it's going to be a whole lot more effort for you. And so it's really a lot more work, it's a lot more time to do any of this if you wait. A couple of the early detection species that I want to let you know about. One of them that we just found out about last spring that we have a couple populations of in Wisconsin is this buttercup. It's called lesser celandine, blooms super early in the spring, in April, and then dies back by the end of May. But it's still taking up space in the forest. And so the couple sites that we found have completely spread along a floodplain in a couple of the rivers in southeast Wisconsin. In Cleveland, where they've had this problem, it's actually spread up into the forest floors, and almost every park they have in Cleveland is just the forest floors are dominated by this plant. So we really want to get this one out as soon as we can before it gets like Cleveland here. Japanese hops is another one we're really concerned about. It's spreading in the streams in the southwest part of the state, and it very quickly can dominate the stream. It's an annual, and it can get into an area like this and just completely dominate an area, and it actually kills everything else that's on the shoreline, and then it dies back in the fall when it gets cold, and then the whole shoreline is exposed for erosion. So big problem. So this is one of those that we really want to get people to report and control as soon as possible. Another one that, an example of one that is fairly widespread, but at your local area, you might be able to catch it while it's still early, is teasel. There's 2 different species of teasel. They both behave about the same. Super easy to identify any time of year because it has these very distinctive seed pods. You've probably all seen them growing up if you've driven in the Fox Valley area or even around the Beltline around Madison. You've seen these. Really easy to control by mowing or by pulling or by digging if you catch it early. But if you let it go to seed, look at all those seeds that develop in just one plant. And you've got a problem if you let this go to seed. Okay, I'm going to quickly run through some of these control methods. There's a wide variety of different control methods, and what you're going to use really depends on your site and on the species and what you have the capability of doing. And there's lots of resources out there on our website and other places that you can use to figure out what control method is going to work best for you. There's manual control methods, mechanical methods, chemical methods, and then biological methods, which we're not going to go into in any detail here, which is using insects to control a species or a disease that's specific to that species. So for manual methods, the most common thing is to hand pull things. So this is what you do if you have garlic mustard in your yard, is you're going to hand pull it. Good idea to always wear gloves. There's some species that you really need to wear gloves to deal with them. But even for something like garlic mustard, which you can eat, you should be doing it anyway, just in case, because you're going to grab other things as well. Be sure to get the entire root. If you don't, it'll just resprout, and you're going to have more sprouts coming up. And you want to make sure you're careful about what you do with those tops as far as disposal. If you have a large area, like you're working on a park and you have a patch as big as this room, and you're going to have a couple people come and hand pull, you're just going to burn them out, and there is no way you're going to get it controlled with hand pulling. Don't even try. You really, if you're going to be doing it, you need to use an herbicide instead. And so if you just have small areas, then certainly hand pulling is something that's reasonable. So if you need to dispose of some of these things, there's a couple of things you can do. Here's an example of with garlic mustard. If you break off this top, there's little buds right up here that will start and send new sprouts. So it's important to dispose of really carefully. And here's some things that you can do. We've just recently found out that composting at municipal facilities or good industrial facilities where they actually have large compost piles and they get the heat up to a proper temperature and they have a mix of carbon and nitrogen ratios and they're really doing it correctly, you can kill most seeds with that. I have a colleague who recently did his master's research on that and found that both garlic mustard and buckthorn seeds, which are big, heavy, hard seeds, are killed within only a few days in a properly managed compost pile. Your backyard compost pile that's a little pile in a little bin is not going to get hot enough to do that. And so if you're going to be putting seeds in your compost pile, you are probably going to get things germinating out of your compost. So be really cognizant of where you're putting these things. If you can, drying these things out and burning them is a great way to dispose of these things, especially brush, but most of us don't have that opportunity. And you can, if it's one of these plants that are legally regulated now as a restricted or prohibited species, they can be sent to the landfill, although brush is really not appropriate to send to a landfill unless it's chipped. There's a lot of leverage tools you can use to pull, and so this one is called a weed wrench. There's a number of others as well, and they work really well. You clamp them onto the base of the stem and yank it out, and a lot of these plants are fairly shallow rooted, and so they're fairly easy to use. But you have to be careful because they really do create this, this very disturbed site. You can also dig these things out or cut them out. This is a parsnip predator. It's actually a tool that's ground down in order for you to. So you're shoveling out only this little area where the actual root is, rather than the entire area. And so you can get the root out easily with that. These are parsnip, wild parsnip plants that are being pulled here. And sometimes you can actually hand pull things like parsnip as well. But of course, parsnip is something you have to be wearing gloves and long sleeves and long pants if you're going to be working with that. Mowing can be really effective if you have a large area and it's something that you just want to keep it from going to seed. You're not going to kill anything with mowing, but you can keep it from going to seed and keep it from spreading. So it can be very effective if you do it at the right time. If you do it too late in the season, you're just going to be spreading stuff. Fire is a very good tool, depending on what your situation is. If you have an oak woodland, if you have a savanna restoration, if you have a prairie, fire is a very good tool for doing control work. It's not something you should be doing if you're not trained on how to do it, and you should never be doing it alone. You should always have enough people there with you. I learned very early in life, my dad liked to go out and burn the fields next to our house, and we had to call the fire department more than once because it got out of hand when it was just he and I out there taking care of this, and he didn't know what he was doing, and neither did I. So you really need to do it right, and you need to do it at the right time of year, and you have to make sure that you have decent fuel in there. Otherwise, the fire, you're not going to get a hot enough fire in order to actually kill some of those seedlings and things that are coming up. If you're in a city, one of the things you can actually do is use a propane torch, and this can be done like on a fairly damp day. Like even if it's just like kind of misting rain, then it's really safe because you're not going to get a fire started, and it works really well on seedlings. And so in this case, you're looking at garlic mustard seedlings, and when they first germinate, then you just have this bed of seedlings, and you hit those with a torch, and you've killed them off because they don't have a good root system developed yet, and so it's really easy to kill them that way. If these were more mature plants, you wouldn't be able to kill them with just a torch because they'd have a good root system. Herbicides are something that you need to use really cautiously and safely. If you're not familiar with using herbicides, then get a lot of advice before you start using it. Make sure you follow the label directions. Every herbicide is designed specifically for certain types of plants and certain types of uses at certain amounts. And so if it says use 1 ounce per gallon, don't use 2 ounces per gallon and think it's going to work better. What it probably will do is burn down those plants, and instead of being absorbed down into the root system and kill the whole plant, you've just killed off the top, and that's not going to get you there. It's just going to resprout from the root system. So use it as the label actually tells you to use it. Make sure you're using the proper herbicide for the site. I was talking with somebody here yesterday who said that he was using Tordon for some of his brush control, and one of his hickory trees right next to the brush got sick and died. Well, yes, Tordon, first of all, you're not supposed to use Tordon if you're not a certified applicator, and we know that it translocates through root grafts from the plant that you're spraying to the tree next door. And so people kill their trees by doing that, and this guy probably did that. And so really be careful of what you're doing. Be careful of any drift that you're doing. Never do it on a windy day. And you wear the right equipment. At minimum, you're going to want to wear good gloves that are rubber gloves, and so that you're not getting it on your skin. Rubber boots are a good idea, and then some kind of clothing that you can wash separately from all the other family clothing. And be really careful about tracking that pesticide as well. So some real basics about herbicides. You can either have a pre-emergent herbicide or a post-emergent herbicide. So something like Roundup that a lot of you are familiar with is a post-emergent herbicide. It kills plants that are already up. A pre-emergent herbicide is something that you put on the ground to kill things when they first come up. If you're an organic gardener, you can use corn gluten, which you can get at feed stores, and use that as a pre-emergent, and it actually kills the seedlings after they germinate. So there's a number of different things you can do. Some herbicides work in both ways. They also, they either have a selective herbicide, like something that maybe only kills grasses, or something that's non-selective, like, again, like Roundup, that kills everything that it touches. And then you can have ones that are just contact only. They only kill the top tissue, or it can be systemic, so it actually gets into the root system. For most of the time, you're going to want a systemic herbicide, something that actually kills the roots. The technique that's used by most people for a lot of the woody species is a cut stump treatment, where you actually cut the plant down and then you apply the herbicide to the stump. You really only need to apply it to that inner bark area in order to prevent resprouting. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the details on this, but it's something that's fairly easy. It's very targeted. You're not getting the herbicide all over everything else. There's a lot of other ways you can apply herbicide to a stem. There's basal bark application here is used fairly commonly, and then some of these other techniques are used as well. A foliar herbicide application is what a lot of people think about when they about herbicide, and that's when you're actually spraying it on the leaves or on the plant. And so again, you need to be really careful, make sure you're doing it just correctly, following the label instructions, doing it at the right time. If you do it at the wrong time of the year, you've wasted your time and you've just put a lot of pesticide out on the landscape. And almost always it's going to take more than once to do it. So as a landowner, some of the things that you want to be doing about invasive species is learn to identify these things, get it identified, and before they're a problem, don't watch something that you say, oh, that thing looks kind of odd, it's kind of weedy, it's been spreading a little bit, but I'm going to wait a couple of years and see if it really takes off. You are just asking for trouble if you do that. Get it figured out as soon as you start noticing it. Monitor your property and watch for things. Prioritize your control efforts. Some things maybe aren't worth working on. And then follow recommended control methods and prevent the spread. And I'm going to show you a couple of resources that are available. Throughout the state, we have cooperative invasive species management areas. These are groups of people that help people with work on invasive species work. And so they're all available. These are on our website and on the Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin website. And these are some of the websites that are available. The one that I do want to point out is this Midwest Invasive Plant Network website has a really great control system on it, where you type in the name of a plant and it'll tell you all the different control methods that work really well for that plant. And it'll show you ones that are chemical and ones that are non-chemical, and how good it works the first year and how good it works a year later. So it's a really useful site. Okay, I really want to quickly run through earthworms, because some of you are familiar with earthworm issues, and most of you probably think earthworms are great things, and yes, they are good in a garden for the most part, and they do certainly aerate garden soils, but they're also problematic in our forest especially. None of our earthworms that we have here in Wisconsin are native to Wisconsin. We had a mile thick of ice here during the glacial period, and none of the earthworms survived that. It's really tough to survive thousands of years through underneath a mile of ice. And so as the glaciers receded, then our forest eventually developed, and that was without the earthworms, because we didn't have people moving things around in trucks and other things that were moving earthworms at the time. So all of our earthworms that we have here now, for the most part, are European. They're all species that were brought over here for bait, or they came over in soil when people brought over plants. Lots of different ways they got here. We have 3 different groupings of earthworms, and one group is the ones that are way up on the soil surface. The epigeic ones. They're generally fairly small and not big problem. Another group is the ones that are down a little bit lower. The ones that are more of a problem are the night crawlers, because they reach up, they grab the organic matter and pull it down, and then essentially eliminate organic matter from the soil surface. So this is what you have happen in a forest. This is an uninfested forest where you have this nice cushiony layer of organic matter that breaks down over several years. In a heavily worm-infested area, they pull that down into the soil, and you end up having this very hard surface. If you walked in a woodlot that has a really hard surface on it, you have a lot of worms there. This is what happens to trees. This is the original soil line of this tree, and this is where it is now because of the earthworms. And you can see it in a forest where you can see how this hard-packed soil here, because the earthworms are in this area here. The earthworms have already been in this area, and this is all Pennsylvania sedge. It's one of the few species that does really well after earthworms have come through. And that and a number of other weedy, non-native species do really well in these environments. And so the earthworms actually create a habitat for these weedy species. And garlic mustard, we know, almost always comes in after earthworms. So I do want to mention this new worm that we found in the state just a few years ago. We found it first here in Madison at the Arboretum, and it's probably was in other places as well. We knew it was going to come eventually. We knew it was out in New England, and that it comes in soil and sometimes comes in plants, but it's really hard to prevent it moving it. And it's very easy to identify as opposed to some of these European earthworms. It's much more firm when you hold onto it. It feels like the body of a snake in that it's firm, and it thrashes about. It wiggles about for the first minute or so that you're holding, to the point where it like jumps off your hand. They don't actually leap. They don't like leave the ground, but they do jump around. They can actually lose their tails when they're thrashing around. And this clitellum, which is a band that's on all earthworms that are mature. You won't see it on an immature worm, because this is the reproductive structure. It's completely solid all the way around on these worms. The European earthworms are hermaphroditic. They take two worms to reproduce. Any two worms have both male and female parts to them. These jumping worms only are parthenogenic. They only take one worm. They don't have to reproduce. They don't have to mate at all. And so as soon as they become mature, they start sloughing off these cocoons, which essentially is what overwinters. So the adults die off, but the cocoons overwinter. And it's a problem because they reproduce very quickly. We have at least 2 generations a year. Where we first started finding them in Maple Bluff, which is a suburb of Madison, we found a landscaper was putting down 3 to 4 inches of wood chip mulch, very fine wood chip mulch on these landscape beds 3 to 4 times a year, and it was disappearing. And the plants she was putting in the beds were dying because the mulch was being eaten down. So they eat not only the mulch, they eat the organic matter, they eat the roots of the plants, and they eat the soil itself. So that you end up with this coffee ground kind of frass of worm poop, essentially, that is what the entire soil is in those areas. And we have a terrarium of it over at the UW Extension booth if you're interested in going to look at that. And so they cause lots of changes. The cocoons overwinter, and very easy to identify the soil if you think that you might have them. You're not going to see the worms themselves until like July, because they're very small. They hatch out in like May, and then they're growing, and so you may see them in June, but they're not fully mature, and so you won't be able to really identify them until they're mature in around July. And then by September, you have a second generation, and that's the time when you can really see them. If you have these worms, you'll find them by September. We know that they get spread around in mulch, in wood chips, in grass clippings, in plants. They got to the Arboretum because that was where they always put their plants when they brought them in from other places, and that's the area where they originally were found. And this is what they'll do to a root ball of a plant, where they actually feed on all those roots. And you can see that kind of granular structure of that soil. That's basically all been processed through earthworm bodies. And so when a garden club or somebody else, digs up plants from their yard and then sells them, every one of those plants, if that yard was infested, they're transporting those earthworms too. So to keep from getting them, if you don't already have them, try to minimize what you're bringing into your yard. Bring in clean soil from, that's like topsoil that's actually come from places that's actually, that it's sterilized. Or, bring in plants, look at the plants carefully, see if they have that soil signature of that granular soil, and don't bring them in if you think they might have the earthworms in them. Otherwise, you will infest your whole yard. If you already have them in your yard, don't give people plants from your yard. Don't take your plants from your yard here to your cabin up north, because you will infest the north woods. And at this point, we don't know of any infestations in the north yet. And so we really want to keep it that way. So we know that they're spread in wood chips. In leaf mulch, they like to climb up into the leaf piles, and then the leaves are collected and then shredded, and then they are used as mulch. And we know that they're spread as bait. And they don't really make great bait because they break. Remember, they're really brittle. They wiggle for a little while, but they don't keep wiggling all the time. But they're sold as Alabama jumpers online. You're not allowed to buy them in Wisconsin. This is a restricted species in Wisconsin, but it is something that is still being sold. So lots of folks are impacted. If you live in the Madison area, you may already have these in your yard. And it's actually, they've been found throughout the southeast part of Wisconsin. So this map is old. Unfortunately, now we have pretty much a line like this. So pretty much the southeast corner of the state all had reports of the jumping worms. There's a number of things you can do to prevent the spread of these, mostly just being careful not to bring stuff into your property that might have it, and if you think you have them, don't let things leave your property, including like your shoes. You might want to clean off the mud off your shoes before you go somewhere if you know you've been in a place that is infested. There's not a lot we know about right now about what we can do to kill them. We know that there is a chemical that's being used on golf courses that causes earthworms to come up and then they desiccate in the sun. And we're trying that out to see if that works or not. And it's still in the experimental phases. We have several different grad students that are working on earthworms right now. So we're really doing most of the research here in Wisconsin. There hasn't been a lot of research done elsewhere in the Northeast about these. So if you have any questions after we close out here, then you can come visit our booth, and you can, of course, look at things on our website and those other websites that are out there. And I'll close out now, and then we'll take some questions. So thank you.